All right, hello everyone. We're going to begin. Welcome everyone to the session. I'm Vanessa Meadu. I'm the Communications and Knowledge Exchange Specialist for SEBI-Livestock, the Center for Supporting Evidence-Based Interventions in Livestock, which facilitates the Livestock Data for Decisions Network, LD4D. Before we say anything more, we are recording this meeting and we will publish the recording to our YouTube channel afterwards, so please be aware of that. You can use the chat anytime for any questions and comments, and we will do our best to address these, especially during the dedicated Q&A session. During the Q&A, we will allow you to turn your video and microphones on if you have a question that you'd like to ask. But we will keep you on mute until discussions begin. So I'm going to do an experiment. Before we begin, we'll put up a poll because we'd like to understand what brought you here today. So this poll should be popping up now. You can enter your response. Panelists, you're very welcome to do the same. So why are you interested in this topic? I'll give you a moment. The topic being livestock decision makers' data needs. Are you seeing the results live? Great. So we have some people who want to measure impact, some people who are dealing with real life problems, approaching it from an academic side and a policy side. Interested in data use and data needs. Great. I'll give you another 10 seconds and then I'll close the poll. People are interested in policy implementation and people on the ground. That's great. Okay, I'm closing the poll. It won't be your last chance. You can also post in the chat if you have more to say. So thanks to everyone who responded there. So as I mentioned, we're here because we're talking about livestock decision makers' data needs, who, what, and how. So to understand why we're here and why we're talking about this important topic, I will hand over to Karen Smyth, Program Director of SEBI-Livestock.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. I'd also like to extend my welcome to everyone to today's session, which focuses on understanding the data needs of livestock decision makers. So why are we doing this? As many of you will know, the LD4D mission is to drive better data for better decisions. And the LD4D Steering Committee asked SEBI-Livestock to commission a study to understand who the livestock decision makers are within low and middle income countries, and also what their decisions, what their data needs are. So the intention of this study is to help inform which challenges the LD4 network can address and ensure we produce useful and impactful data and evidence. So we're very pleased to be launching the guide today, and we'll be telling you more about that later in today's webinar. So the purpose of today's discussion is really to share the guide with you and some of the insights that we've learned, but we're also going to hear from some of the community members on how they're working to understand and respond to the decision makers' needs. Do you want to go to the next slide, Vanessa? So this is how the agenda looks today. We're going to start off with Bernard Kimoro. Many of you will know him already, Kenyan Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock Development, and also LD4D Steering Committee member. And Bernard's going to talk about why we're here and a case for understanding decision makers' data needs. Then we'll move on to Marilyn Moin, who was involved in the piece of work that the decision maker work that we commissioned, and Marilyn is from the Busara Centre for Behavioural Economics. But today Marilyn will talk about why and how do we approach a data problem for a behavioural science perspective. Then we'll move on to Vanessa, who you all know and have met, and Vanessa will talk about the study itself, the decision maker study, what we did and what we learned. This is followed by 2 case studies, Beverley, Hatcher-Mbu from Development Gateway. We will talk about understanding and responding to decision makers' data needs through the ALIVE programme in Ethiopia. And finally, Gary Watmough from Edinburgh University, who will talk about work that he's doing on data use in Kenya through the Jamil Observatory. And then we hope to round off the session with a roundtable and a Q&A. So that's the lineup for today, and I'm handing back to Vanessa.
Good, thank you so very much. So I'd like to invite our first speaker, Bernard Kimoro. Bernard, can you turn your video on, please? There he is. Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you and see you. Great. I'm welcome to our session. So Bernard is head of climate change and livestock sustainability at the Kenya Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock Development, and he is also a member of the LD4D steering committee. So Bernard, I'd like to ask you, as a decision maker who is responsible for livestock in the Kenyan government, what do you want the group here, the LD4D members here, to know about understanding and responding to your data needs?
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be in this webinar. I'm sorry, I've just been traveling and I'm on the way. I just left Kenya and arrived in Kigali, so I chose a spot where I could sit and at least give my my points. Hopefully, I'll be able to make all of them through. One thing I want to say is that sometimes I get a feeling that there is a disconnect between the data needs for the policy makers and the people who are actually generating this data. A case in point is that we find there's a lot of research which is being done in very many research institutions, in very many organizations, but the link to how this research can be used either for policy interventions or coming up with programs and measures has not been demonstrated quite a lot. And therefore that begs the question, what as policymakers, what is our need in terms of data? Why do we need this data? From a policy perspective and being at a policy level, there are various reasons. In Kenya, for example, we are coming up with different policies, strategies, and one of the things that we really rely on is the use of the policy that is being generated from different fields. I give an example. We are doing a livestock master plan. We are doing a livestock national livestock strategy as well, and also national livestock policy. One of the things that has been a problem is what data can we be able to use to inform those policy instruments that you're talking about. So you find that there is data, yes, and data can be in various forms. Could be data which is available but is scattered in very many places. So it becomes a bit of a problem that there is data, yes, but we cannot be able to access it from a policy perspective because it is all over and nowhere, if I may use that. Yeah, so that is quite a bit of a challenge. So there's data which is there, which can actually be able to inform policy in coming up with technical interventions or informing policy to come up with the proper technical interventions. but it is scattered and we cannot be able to have it, and it's everywhere. So that is one challenge. The second point is that, yes, and for that one, I give an example, the one where there's data everywhere, but it's almost unavailable for use because it's scattered. Currently, we are doing what we call the dairy NAMA, or pathways to dairy net zero. We started as a dairy NAMA, and we really needed data to be able to inform a number of aspects. One is the issues about emission, potentials, for example, or even the projections of abatement levels and all those kind of things. But we could not really be able to get the data from the researchers, which maybe we are looking at the national researchers or even international like ITRI. So that's where there is data, yes, but it's scattered. The second point is, I think there's a lot of research which is also being done, but this research is not focused on addressing the gaps at the national level. In Kenya, we talk about research being done to generate papers rather than research which is informing the policy. So yes, it is good to do research, generate a lot of data, but does it speak to what the national needs are? That is also another challenge that we also identify in this whole process. So for us, as from a policy level, so we are looking at policies or even data which is coming. It should come to inform the policies that we are looking at. It should also come to support the measures in terms of the projects and the programs that the different national governments should put in place. So so that is the understanding, that as we do our research, as we generate the data, how can we be able to focus more to link the policy aspect with the data that is being generated. Probably we could also look at how do we develop beyond the research, how do we develop policy briefs which can also support the policy level, which has been a problem. And therefore, when we look at how do we obtain this, of course, there's the research for the identified gaps. That is critical. So let's identify the gaps, do the research, and feed the policy needs. And of course, the other aspect, which is also a problem, is yes, we have the data, and it is scattered. But how best can we be able to develop different database systems which are open, for example, to be applied by different policy level institutions to be able to inform the changes that are required. I don't know whether I've digressed so much. I'm a bit distracted, and I hope you'll be able to understand how my situation is. So for us,
thank you so much.
Yeah. So finally, I just wanted to say that currently, the initiative, for example, from LD4D is quite innovative, where you are aggregating all this data together. But I'm also happy that from a policy perspective, I'm also incorporated, and I can also be able to see how this can benefit policy level, but also inform the researchers on what kind of data that is required, which is also quite critical. So I hope these are the issues that we can be able to discuss and see how best we can be able to link all this, not just policy and research, but policy, research, and the practitioners. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bernard, for that. I think you gave us some very practical examples of some of the data gaps that you and your team are struggling with. Data is scattered, it's not useful, it's not usable. You're trying to make some very concrete decisions and apply the data for very specific purposes, and it's not fit for use, perhaps, or it's not really what the work that's happening around, in the academic institutions is not actually feeding into addressing gaps at the national level. So these are all really important points, really valid points, and I think for us really brings home the main point, which is that if we don't understand the decision-making needs and the decision, what kind of decisions that are requiring data and evidence, we won't be able to do much that's useful. We'll be producing research for papers, as you say. So thank you very much for setting out that kind of real world context. I'm going to now introduce our next speaker. So Marilyn Moin is an analyst for the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics based in Nairobi, Kenya. Marilyn was part of the study team which undertook the LD4D Decision Makers Data Needs Study, which happened through most of 2022. Marilyn is going to enlighten us on a very important question, which is why and how do we approach a data problem from a behavioral science perspective? So I'll just pop your presentation up. Here we go. Can you see that?
We can see it.
Great. Marilyn?
Yep, I can see it. All right, thank you, Vanessa. So like you said, my name is Marilyn Moin. I'm an analyst with Busara, and I'm here to answer the why and how to approach data from the behavioral science perspective. So just to the next slide, a quick introduction. So Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, also known as Busara, is a research and advisory organization that is dedicated to advancing and applying behavioral science in pursuit of our mission, that is poverty alleviation across different continents such as Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So through our partnerships, we create behaviorally informed solutions that amplify the impact of products and policies, again, across different sectors like finance, education, agriculture, health, and governance. A quick intro into what behavioral science is, a definition. So behavioral science is an analytical approach that uses locally embedded research to explain the human decision-making process. And at Busara, we are dedicated to understanding the context within which the individuals we're working with operate in. And to begin with a quote, so having good data is like having a flashlight. It only illuminates the path. It doesn't make people walk it, just like Bernard had mentioned. Just because you have good data, just because there's data out there doesn't mean it's usable. It could be comprehensive, it could be very accurate, but if it does not have the person it is being designed, the person it is being targeted to have to be able to use it, it becomes almost useless, right? So our minds are far less independent than we would like to believe. Behavioral science does not make the assumption of rationality. It considers that we're influenced by a variety of factors, whether external or cognitive in our decision making. And these factors could be environmental factors, they could be cognitive factors, and they could be also motivators. So Daniel Kahneman, in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, popularized the System 1 and System 2 dual thinking process. So just to take you through this, when you think of how you brushed your teeth today morning, did you put much thought into it, or was it more voluntary and effortless as compared to when you were writing your personal introduction on LinkedIn, which had you pausing for a bit, putting more effort into it, paying a bit more attention into that? And that's just similarly how the decision-making process is. And are we, even as we publish data, as we put out data, are we considering these two systems that humans use even when they're making decisions? So just like Bernard had mentioned, you can have a policy maker and you can have the person on the ground. Ideally, you wouldn't be designing the data or publishing the data in the same way, because these two people have different agendas. And also, just to highlight again the decision-making process, to the next slide. There is the intention and action gap, right? So there's a desire of, I want my animals to be healthy and prosperous, to lead to the outcome of wanting my animal to the outcome where your animals are safe from external illnesses. But the assumption that we make is that this process is linear, when ideally it's more, as the arrows are pointing, it's up and down, up and down. An individual may not be able to understand what AMR is. They may not trust the vaccine itself. There could be misleading prescription information and them not seeing the point at all to this. So the intention of the data that is there and the action that would lead to the desired outcome, there's a huge gap between that. And behavioral science does not make the assumption that there is no gap. So even at Busara, what we do is we try to understand the human decision-making process at each of these steps. So what does applied behavioral science offer? So just again, with understanding the context, it offers a rigorously developed base of insights for us to be able to understand decision-making and behavior. And once you have understood, you would want to design a solution. So even when you're designing the solution, next slide. When you're designing the solution, behavioral science offers interventions and a set of techniques that allows you to develop these interventions and helps you improve decision-making and behavior. And once you have designed this, you would like to assess whether the interventions you've created have made an impact. And these tools help you assess whether they have changed any behavior. And they're based on understanding that behavior change is really, really, really hard to make. Next slide. And again, we are all human beings. The people using this data are human beings. So what the human-centered design process offers is it offers problem solvers a chance to design with communities. And questions that we should be asking ourselves, even as, again, we publish data, we come up with data, we generate data, is who is the target audience, or who are the people you are collecting this data for, and the context in which they're operating in. You would not ideally be collecting data in the same way for different people to use. Just an example, traffic light in, let's say, my country is more of a suggestion for red means stop as compared to other countries where red actually means stop. What type of data is being collected and for what purpose? Like, what is the intention of use for the end user that you are presenting this data? How are you collecting this data, right? Are these methods appropriate for the respondents or for the people you're collecting from? Just like Ben had mentioned, if you're on the ground and you want to collect data from a farmer, pictures makes more sense rather than asking them, type all the symptoms and diseases that you think your cow is exhibiting. And again, for those who are planning to leverage behavioral science, testing is your compass to success. So invest your time in active listening, continuous learning, thoughtful design, and being open to discard potential solutions that don't align. Because again, sometimes you create an intervention or come up with a solution and it might not work, and that's just because it's not working. It's because it's not being the people that you intended for it to use, they're not receiving it the way you'd like, and that's no problem. Just test, and test again. And lastly, to finish off with another quote, data is as good as the questions that are asked. You could have good data, you could have the best data, but if you did not ask questions to pull out the answers that are needed. Just another example, in a household where you have a male dominant, the house is purely led by the husband, and you're asking questions that only the women can ask. For example, if you know your child's teacher, or if you know your last born's birthday, that's more likely a question that a mother would be able to answer compared to a father. No offense to fathers. So again, data is as good as the questions that are asked and how you're asking them. That is it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. That was really interesting. I think for many of us, I'm going to assume, but especially for me, I mean, I had not really thought about a behavioral science approach in the context of livestock data, livestock development, livestock for decisions. And so this has been really eye-opening in terms of understanding how much actually factors in to decision making beyond just saying, well, we have this really great data set, you know, let's get it used. There's just like this whole journey that needs to happen that you've described. We have time for maybe one or two clarification questions for Marilyn. If there's any, you can put your hands up. There's a raise hand button, or you can just type it in the chat. But we'll have Marilyn on our panel later, so it's not the last you'll hear from her. So any thoughts, any quick questions from the audience or even from the panel at this point? And if not, we will just move on. Okay.
Vanessa, we have one question from Sega, I think.
Okay. We'll have to, can you unmute him or her? Can you unmute them, please? Sega, I think we're trying to unmute you so you can ask your question. Or you can type the question in the chat if it's not working. Okay, just a moment. No, okay, we'll come back. If you want to type your question in the chat, please do so, and we'll definitely come back to it. Okay, so I am actually going to take the next presentation. So as Karen mentioned, today we're really pleased to release a new guide that shares insights from a decision makers data needs study that was undertaken by the LD4D Secretariat. The new guide offers sort of insights from our study and a step-by-step guide to anyone else who wants to undertake a similar study. It's interactive, it's on livestockdata.org. We encourage you to explore it. You can also download the PDF. There's an introductory video you can watch as well. So please take the time after the session to explore that. But I'm going to take you through some of our key insights and findings. So that's what the guide looks like on the website. So in 2021, the LD4D Steering Committee asked for a study to help our network better understand the livestock decision makers' needs, and we undertook the study together with the Busara Center. So the guide outlines two distinct phases of work, each broken down into practical steps that anyone can follow. We assembled a study team, which was made up of behavioral scientists, as well as livestock experts, and we also sought advice from the LD4D Steering Committee. One of the first things the team did was to develop a definition of decision maker, and that definition was an individual or an organization that uses livestock-based data to make implementation-based decisions. So that was the definition that we landed on for our study. Because LD4D focuses on low and middle income countries, we decided to try to narrow our scope, and we undertook a rigorous prioritization exercise to do that. So we included criteria like livestock contributing substantially to a country's economy. We wanted representation, countries from different regions, and also countries that are priority investment areas for our funders. So after several iterations, we agreed to focus on Ethiopia, Nigeria, South Africa, and India for our study. The steering committee helped us to identify key informants. These are people who have inside knowledge about the main players in the livestock sector. And so we undertook interviews with the key informants, and they helped us narrow down a number of thematic areas within the country's livestock sector. They helped us focus in on data sources and areas for investment. And after going through that process, we were able to find that decision makers naturally fell into two main categories, what we call doers. Those are decision makers who operate at the grassroots level, who are directly impacted by livestock policies, and then influencers whose actions influence the decisions of the doers. So you can also think about it as micro and macro, and that was really a helpful framing for us. And in particular, our key informants highlighted the importance of public sector decisions and decision makers and some of the challenges in making evidence-based decisions in the public sector. So I want to share with you the output of phase 1. This is what we consider a living map of livestock decision maker groupings and the kinds of decisions being made within each level, which could require data and evidence. So if you look at the smallest circle, these are the doers, the sort of the first rank, or so the primary closest to the ground doers. And then you kind of zoom out a little bit and you have the secondary doers. These are more of the community, corporations as decision makers. And then you continue to zoom out further and you see the different kinds of influencers. So we have businesses as influencers, we have research as influencers, we have government as the macro influencers, and we also have donors, which funding can also influence. So we believe this map is a useful starting point for the LD4D network to focus its efforts on decision makers. It's obviously quite specific to the study that we did, but if you undertake your own study, you may produce a similar map or a different map depending on your own context. So this is, we see it as a living map, so it's something that we'd like to come back to and update, and it may evolve with feedback over time. In phase 2, we focused on understanding the decision makers' data needs. So our study identified public sector policy and strategy as an area where evidence-based decision-making remains a challenge, and we chose to use livestock master plans as an entry point. For phase 2, we actually assembled country focus groups made up of professionals who could provide insights into the use or the non-use of livestock-based data to make implementation-based decisions, and our focus groups included policy influencers and policy implementers. For these focus groups, we didn't end up working due to various constraints with grassroots or community level doers, and so that's something that we would do differently in the future if we had a chance to do this again, or if we do further studies. So policy influencers, as I mentioned, these are people perhaps employed by the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock. They're people who help to develop national livestock policies and strategies and investment plans. The policy implementers typically work in government departments or in the private sector, providing services to farmers. So we had a number of interactive discussions. We used online whiteboards and a number of different interactive tools to encourage participants to reflect on the different sources of data that they use for a range of decisions. We asked them questions about the role of data in decision making, what data sources they rely on, what are the gaps, the frequency of data use, data flows. So these discussions helped us form insights about which data sources are valuable for different kinds of decisions. And they also revealed different habits in decision making. So you can see from this chart, we have sort of 5 different broad kinds of decisions that are being made: routine decisions, operating decision, organizational, decisions under uncertainty, and decisions under pressure. And as you can see, each type of decision relies on a very different mix. So not just one kind of data, on multiple kinds of data, but very different mixes of data. And we consider experience and intuition data as well. So some of the decisions, like routine decisions, like brushing your teeth, perhaps what Marilyn was talking about, you just follow your intuition, you follow your experience. If you're working under uncertainty, you're going to rely on very different types of data. So from the people we spoke with, policy designers tended to choose data based more on convenience, on data quality, on accessibility. Policy implementers are more influenced by budgets, institutional hierarchies, and the need to present a consistent narrative. So again, if you undertake this study in your own work, you might define a completely different mix of data habits, data use habits, data types that are being used for different types of decisions. But hopefully it gives you some useful insight into where the opportunities might be for you to help inform the data and the decisions. So what are the main conclusions? What are the main questions? It's hard to boil this all down, but the study did shed some light onto who the key decision makers are in our study area. It reminded us that decision makers rely on different sources of data depending on the type of decisions they need to make. And that decisions can be informed by multiple data and information sources, including intuition and experience. So this raises questions about which sources of data LD4D can influence and how. We don't have the answer yet, but certainly it's led us to start thinking about things differently. I also want to mention that there are many things that we could do differently. We do outline this in the guide. So for example, we would be more proactive in addressing issues around social inclusion, and we would ensure participation from more community level actors. So we've written that into the steps so that you can, be aware of some of those opportunities and challenges as you undertake your own study. So what are we going to do next? We really see this as a resource for the LD4D network. The case study only covered a small part of the livestock sector, and we really think it could be expanded to cover other areas. The LD4D Secretariat are planning to use this method to better understand decision-making around climate finance for the livestock sector. And we see this as the first step towards forming a working group, a new working group on this topic. So we're trying to be very thinking about the decision maker needs first, rather than saying, oh, we have this cool data that, rather than being supply driven, being much more demand driven. So it's something that we're trying to internalize within the way that LD4D operates, and it's something that we want to share with all of our members. If you're interested in better understanding the needs of your livestock decision makers, we do encourage you to use the guide and test this approach. And we would be interested in refining the approach based on your feedback, and even potentially developing some case studies showing how the method can be applied. So we look forward to continuing the conversation. And I'll leave you with the website, the QR code. So I'll send around this in an email after the webinar if people want to explore this on their own time. Thanks very much. All right, so Karen was very much involved in the original study, so I just want to ask if she has anything that she'd like to add to what I just presented.
No, I think you give a good overview. Thank you very much, Vanessa. As Vanessa said, this is a living document, and we're very willing to update it. And I think having more case studies to test it could be a real benefit. It's really just I think we've tried to provide our insights, things that went well, could be done better, to help you in implementing your studies and to get to the answers quicker. So hopefully you will learn from some of our lessons. But yeah, I look forward to questions on this later.
Great. So then it's a good time now to turn to more of our presenters. So we've invited Beverley, Hatcher-Mbu, and Gary Watmough, who are involved in separate projects that are trying to improve data-driven decision-making in the context that they're working in. We invited them because we're familiar with their projects, and we really felt like they're dealing with these exact questions. You know, at the moment, the projects are both sort of in the earlier stages of development. So I'm going to hand over to Beverley. While she gets her presentation on the screen, I'll just introduce her. So Beverley Hatcher-Mbu is Deputy Director of Programs at Development Gateway, which supports a livestock information vision for Ethiopia, ALIVE, and that's a program to empower Ethiopia's stakeholders in the livestock sector to make data-informed decisions by providing relevant, accurate, and timely digital livestock data and analytics. I hope I got that right. Thanks very much, Beverley. So over to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Vanessa. This is great. That means I can skip some of the boring part of the presentation. Great. So just to share a little bit about us at DG, just for general context, sort of how we approach problems, who we are when we approach problems shapes how you address them. Right. So Development Gateway, we're really a team of technologists, both software developers and people on the project management side who are really passionate about the use of data and technology to solve some of our world's biggest challenges. So we bring that lens into the work that we do around data and decision making. We are not new to Ethiopia. We've been working with different parts of different sectors and different parts of the Ethiopian government for approximately 15 years. So we've built some of our approaches based on some hard-won lessons learned in a couple of different areas, from tobacco health to fertilizer. So Vanessa gave a really great intro to the program, and I love that this is where I am, or this is where we are in the schedule, because I think Bernard, Marilyn, Vanessa, and Mary from the chat from the African Union, IBAR, have pulled out some really great things that I want to pull out as I go into sort of why we do what we do on ALIVE. Bernard said something that stood out to me. He said that there's essentially a disconnect between data producers and data users. I think Marilyn took that a step forward and highlighted how multiple factors are at play when we're talking about data. And Mary in the chat summed it up perfectly by saying that data is useless without putting it in context. And really, that's essentially what we are trying to do with the ALIVE program, by touching on many different streams of work that are all interconnected when we talk about how do we create and place the right data for the right decision makers at the right time. So our program is built around improving accessibility, improving interoperability, so really the connection of systems and people, improving reliability and use of data. And that is anchored through a data standard, a livestock information system, so an actual technical platform, integration of several existing databases into that system, since a lot of systems are already collecting valuable data on livestock in Ethiopia, and then strengthening the broader data use culture. And I'll talk about those 4 areas in a little bit more detail. So these are just the key objectives, which I've summarized at a high level, what we're hoping to achieve over the next 4 years. We're approaching the end of year 1 of the program. So when interoperability is a big word that I find difficult to pronounce, but what it really boils down to is layering different kinds of data together tells a better story. When a decision maker goes in, and if we're using a policymaker as an archetype, we know that the decision maker isn't just looking at vaccinations, or isn't just looking at ear tags, isn't just looking at breeding. Ideally, a decision maker in livestock wants to look at many different pieces of what is happening in the livestock sector at once. This part of one of the challenges with data use for decision makers is that data is scattered, as I think Bernard mentioned earlier, in so many different places. So when we talk about interoperability in the course of our program, ALIVE, we're really looking at, these are 5 of the databases, not the only 5, but 5 that cover most of the use cases that policymakers have identified to us in a previous stage of the program, as these are the things that they want to know about. These are the items, these are decisions that they need to make, and this is the kind of data that would help them make it. Right now, they're going to these 5 systems, separate systems, to get that information. So one of our larger goals, objectives of the program is to try to combine these different data sources into one place that will help decision makers access that information quickly and easily and visually. To do that, you really need a standard, and I'd mentioned that a little bit earlier. So you'll notice that our program is structured in different work streams because we find that data use and packaging data in a way that decision makers can use effectively requires you to touch on many things. It requires you to have governance and standards that permit data sharing and make it easier to look at different data sets interoperably or combining different data sets together. It requires a change to how many decision makers and data producers produce their data and how they put it together. It requires strengthening of existing technological systems. There are many of them, whether we're talking about Excel or whether we're talking about a digital tool. It also means building out the architecture in the long run to be able to centralize some of this information in ways that people can use. And then it also, of course, relates to the front end or the dashboard. You have all of this great data, you have all this great data sets, but I don't know about you, sometimes looking at really dense Excel sheets is very difficult for me to feel excited about. So we think a lot about visualizations. You have this data, you have this information. What is the best way to visualize information in a way that a policymaker can look and take insights from that? We're all humans. Humans tend to be quite visually engaged, so we shape our dashboard development around that. This is just a little bit about how we are governed on the program, and why that's important is because one of the key things to engaging effectively with decision makers is making sure that you have the right people in the room from the beginning and not at the end. This requires, we have team members on our program in Ethiopia, in Europe, in Washington, DC. We have staff embedded at the Ethiopian Ministry of Agriculture, and we continuously engage with the Ministry of Agriculture's ICT team on a weekly basis. Why this operating modality matters is that sometimes we forget that there are decision makers at all levels of the value chain. Sometimes it starts at the national level, but it goes all the way down to the local or warada level in Ethiopia, for example. And you need to be engaging at different levels with many people in this chain in order for that gap between data producer and data user to close. One of the other tools that we've used to help us really, again, to continue to close that gap is around making sure that we continuously assess what needs are. So there's one side of it, which I've hinted at already, which is engaging with the use cases, understanding the kinds of decisions that decision makers need to make when they make them, and what data would help them make those decisions better or more effectively. The other side of that is that you have all this data, but not everybody knows how to use it or analyze it in ways that serves their purposes. So part of our training needs assessment process, the first round, which we just completed a few months ago, was to look at different agencies and institutes within the Ministry of Agriculture and understand what are their current practices, skills, and training needs, and how can we fill that gap? Is it comfort with using Excel? Is it knowing how to do analysis with more sophisticated statistical tools? Often we don't take the time to ask, what are the practical skills, as well as the data, but what are the practical skills that will help you use data more effectively, and then answer that question with tailored trainings. So we have a portion of our program built around that. So I encourage you, especially if you work closely with ministries and government officials, many who are resource constrained and covering many things at once, they very seldom have time or budget built in to do extensive training to keep up with trends and to keep up with tools. We can do our part to help fill that gap to better place decision makers to use data effectively. Another thing that we look at on a bigger plane, which I'm happy to talk about more, I know I'm trying to be sensitive to time, but resource mobilization. The elephant in the room is that all of this is great, but resources are not unlimited. So how do we think about sustainability from the beginning rather than at the end? A part of that is that we know that the work that we're doing that's Gates funded, we cannot do alone. We need to be able to work effectively and consistently with other partners in this space who are also tackling different areas of the livestock data ecosystem, not just in Ethiopia, but globally. I think I'm sure are a number of you on the call who may work in East Africa and know that that livestock value chain runs through Ethiopia, through Kenya, through Somalia. So thinking also even with a regional lens about how we mobilize resources together. So as a part of that, we've pulled in not only the system owners who we work with, so those are the people behind the systems that we're working with, but also who their funders are and understanding what steps they are taking or other projects they're working on that also contribute to stronger data, contribute to stronger data analysis skills, and contribute in general to a stronger ecosystem. So ecosystem as a term gets used a lot. So when we think about it in our program, we try to be very, very practical about it. It basically means we're all in this together and we need to be thinking both what is in front of us and what we're trying to do, which is linking several databases together, but also thinking how that fits as part of a larger whole. We've learned a lot of lessons in only 10 months or 11 months of operation. Buy-in is a continuous need, from our work plan to our data standards process to how we develop our governance documentation and frameworks to help shape the new digital system. This is a part of where you get your decision makers. Decision makers are busy, but they want to understand where you're going and why. I think Marilyn mentioned it very well, that people are human, data users are human, and they want to understand what's in it for them and why they should be invested in this process, and carrying them along from before we have something to when we do as a part of what makes it easier to come back and say, here's what the data looks like now. Tell us if this meets your need. If it doesn't meet your need, we can be flexible and creative in reformulating it to address your needs. So I talk a little bit about some of the other areas. Co-design is very closely linked with buy-in. You need to have both. If you're going to start the change management process of a new standard to use data in a different way, you need to co-design together. Also, a plug for connecting to other standards processes. We are not the first to come up with the need for a data standard in this, our small sliver of the livestock space. Many other parts of the livestock space, many other subsectors of agriculture have done similar, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There was a really great research done by, I believe, CABI, another research institute, around the soil mapping standards, what worked well in that process and what didn't. And we reviewed that as a team before we started our own standard process. So just a plug to look to one another. I think that's a part of what LD4D does really well. But there's also other lessons we can learn from outside of the livestock space that we should be thinking about to contextualize how we're working with some of the key aspects that are necessary to engage decision makers effectively with data. And lastly, when we're thinking again that data users are human, there's a real risk of burnout. We want ideally lots of buy-in, we want ideally lots of co-design, but we recognize that our key decision makers and our data producers are stretched in many different directions. So part of that is also, when you map decision makers and who your decision makers are, also think about mapping what they're engaged in. Are there existing working groups, committees, or other structures that you could either build scaffold from or otherwise integrate into how you approach your work, to reduce some of the strain on decision makers to be engaged in all of these different processes. And that's it. I'm happy to talk more, but that's just a little bit of a start for us about how we've been approaching decision makers on our program in Ethiopia.
Thank you so much, Beverley. There's a lot to digest there. I think what really stands out to me about the Alive program is that it tries to address so many parts of the data challenge from the outset, from interoperability to governance to training needs to changing culture to long-term sustainability. And so what I'm wondering is, how did you begin? Like, what's the entry point? How do you, do you start with, okay, well, here's the real data problem, or do you start with the people and their needs, with the systems? What's that entry point for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. Even when I say it out loud, I feel a little overwhelmed at times by how much we're trying to do. I think for us, the biggest key, and I think there are people who will disagree with this, but I really find that at least we in our values at DG, we put the government at the center because we fundamentally believe on a values basis that it's government that's going to lead to sustainability. We want data and resources for everybody, not just people who can afford it. So how this helped us when we started off this program is that there was a full 4 years, phase 1, as we call it, where a livestock data ecosystem roadmap was developed. And it was from that process that priorities were identified. People said, okay, there are all these many issues in this area around livestock data in Ethiopia, but we really have a gap in governance. We've got these systems that need to be combined, and we've got to figure out how we help in those 2 areas and build all of the people up who work in these areas in the same direction. So that very much influenced how we structured the program in phase 2. So we weren't just grasping at straws, and that was very much set and directed by the Ministry of Agriculture in Ethiopia to say, look, this is what we need. This is what we need as a priority. Will you help us get there? And I think that that's really a model ultimately when we're talking about having buy-in and we're talking about building sustainably. It's who is going to have it at the end of the day. If we're doing our jobs correctly, if I'm doing my job correctly, we are writing ourselves out of this space and the government runs with it when we leave. So we start planning for training the ICT team in Java this year, not in year 3 or year 4. Because when we get to year 4, the ICT team now runs with the centralized system. They are already working with the different subsystems that feed in. And we are there primarily just as advisors, if needed, to help them with any kinks that come up along the way. So that's sort of what takes us from overwhelm to practicality, which is making sure that we're anchored in what really the principal decision maker, in this case, the government really needs, and then building and approaching in that direction.
Thanks, Beverley. I have lots of more questions for you. I'm going to save them because I want to turn now to Gary and have a chance for all of us to learn about the work that's happening in the Jamil Observatory. So, Gary, over to you.
Okay, you see my screen?
Yes.
Oops, no, that's not right. Hang on. There we go. There you go. Okay, hi everybody. So, yeah, Gary Watmough from the University of Edinburgh and Jamil Observatory for Food Security and Early Action. I'm going to talk more about a process we've gone through to try and overcome some of these challenges that people have been mentioning today in terms of the types of data available, that disconnect between data and data needs and data producers, and how we've gone about trying to overcome some of those issues by running what we called at the time a datathon in Isiolo in Kenya. So this is part of the Jamil Observatory for Food Security Early Action, which is challenged with it's like a long-term project looking at various different issues around food security and coming up with early action, early warning systems. And I've been working on the data challenge question on that side of the project. So the motivation for the event came through sort of 15 months of talking at the community practice meetings and then various different online discussions around what these data challenges were. We put in a few different grant applications and we were developing these ideas, but one of the big challenges was, as Bernard mentioned at the beginning, is this disconnect between data availability, data quality, whether it even exists or not. So we thought getting everybody in a room together and actually exploring some of these data and understanding each of those challenges would be more helpful as we move forwards. So before we went out to Isiolo, my team created this platform you can see on the screen on the left, where it could just bring in some basic data sets that we knew already existed, and it could map them and it could do some various different functions, some basic functions just to help with these discussions. So rather than just talking in a workshop for 2 days about data and finding that that's a bit too abstract for people that have never seen some of these data sets, you could actually start to elucidate some of those issues, demonstrate and visualize some of those data sets and issues. So we spent some time building that, and then within the workshop itself, we were looking at trying to collectively explore some of the needs of the users. It was a small group that were invited, so we invited organizations that knew we knew, had particular data challenges or were producing data sets that could be used. So we had representatives from NGO, from government, and also from the research communities. And the Baringo Pastoralist Network also attended to sort of provide that link to the doers, as was mentioned in the earlier presentations by Vanessa. The way that the meeting was structured, again, we started off with these use case interviews, so with particular individuals from organisations that we already knew had challenges. They were interviewed in front of the wider group around their data usage, their data needs, the challenges they were facing, and we could then, as a wider group, we could find some key themes, and then we could define a couple of topics. We came up with 3 particular working groups and topics to work on. As part of the first morning session as well, we then had a data mapping exercise where we, as a whole group, wrote down all of the different data sets that were either being used or people were aware of that were available. And then they were put on the wall as a kind of like an index. So as you were working through in your group during the afternoon of the first day and into the second day, you could go up to the wall, have a look for a data set that you weren't familiar with, and take it away and try and integrate that into your thinking. And then during the day and a half that we had together as groups, it was a lot of group work, thinking through, but using that platform to actually explore some of these data sets a bit more, helping us to ask different questions, and then reporting back to the wider group. As part of this as well, there was another meeting going on at the side in parallel, which was the community elders were meeting. So we also had an opportunity to report back some of the ideas and some of the developments that we were making to the community elders and getting their perspective on what may or may not work or what would need to be tweaked to provide data and useful outputs for again, I guess the doers, as was mentioned in one of the earlier presentations. One of the projects, just to give an idea of what we were sort of working on, was this integrated livestock vulnerability assessment, coming from a problem that was presented in the interviews around destocking in dryland areas often coming too late. So the price that pastoralists could achieve for their animals was much lower than it would be if they were sold at an earlier time in the year. So the aim was to improve the resilience of herders to provide this additional information by combining all these different data sets that, as Bernard suggested earlier, a lot of this data is already available. It's just in different places. So the 2 things to try and do here for this project were consolidate these data sets into one place, but also to actually combine them in some way to show that additional information rather than just providing an information set on food availability and on livestock numbers, actually combining them somehow to give some more, I guess you're converting the data into usable information. We used that platform to do this, and then we started to discuss how we could maybe use that to guide these destocking and restocking advice and information services to various groups, and also to think about longer term sort of what if analyses, whereby we were looking at climate change scenarios and thinking in a particular area, if climate was going to mean that particular feed types would change, whether there's then you could start to model and think about longer term policy for how livestock, you may need to change what type of livestock you have in a particular area or change other types of behaviours and choices using that information and that data. That's about it for me. So just to sort of finish on what actually happened with this particular workshop idea, it was very successful in terms of showing us what was available, what data existed. Some groups found out whilst in that meeting that they were all collecting very similar information in different parts of the country. So there's obviously, if they could share that information with one another, there's more information to work on. Save the Children have found some ideas with FuseNet to actually build on further analyses. So not even with the research team from Jamil doing that separately. And we at Jamil have started to put grants together on bringing in the climate and the weather services data to try and think through how you would link that to these livestock decision-making platforms. I can finish there, Vanessa.
Thanks so much, Gary. So it's really interesting to hear the sort of, the kind of approach that's being taken with the data users on the ground and getting them to really help map out the data that's available, but also the challenges that are available, and almost kind of then, well, how do we connect A to B? How do we connect what we've got in terms of data with some of the big questions that we're trying to answer? So I'm curious, I'll ask you the same question that I put to Beverley, which is what was the starting point maybe in terms of your own work? What is the entry point? Were you coming to it? I know you're a geospatial analyst, so were you coming to it in terms of thinking, well, I've got some cool maps, I want people to use them, or did you have sort of another lens that got you started on this process?
Well, it's more being sort of involved in Jamil Observatory more widely. I work with socioeconomic data sets and try and combine them with various environmental data, and that's one thing that's coming out through a lot of these discussions with ICPAC and National Drought Monitoring Authority and things, is that impact-based forecasting element where it's policymakers are not just looking for some weather data and it's dry over here. They're actually looking for some additional sort of value added where you're combining these different data sets. So that's where I sort of entered this process, by looking at how do we combine this information. But working in this region on food security in East Africa, finding there's a lot of platforms with a lot of data sets that look remarkably similar, and when you trace them back, they come often from the same source. So you can see as a researcher, it's quite confusing for me, and I'm using this data on a daily basis. So for policymakers, you can see, and decision makers, you can see, it probably gets very confusing. So that's where I entered this, was trying to what can we do to make this data more user-friendly and available to others? We don't want to create a new platform. We'd like to get this data into an existing platform that people are already familiar with and using. But first, we need to actually work out what the data looks like, in terms of what the data looks like internally in an organisation, say like Save the Children or ICPAC or NDMA, who are actually trying to use that to make decisions. What do they want the data to look like, and how can we maybe do that? So that's where I kind of went into that process. I think what I came out with was kind of every organisation is going to want a slightly different version of the same data set. So there's a lot of work to do there, but I think that's quite a important sort of recognition that you can't just create some data as a researcher and whack it on a platform and say job done. The impact is actually working and liaising with those organisations to make sure it's in the right process and the right format.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Just wondering, Beverley, you were nodding along. Do you have some thoughts on what Gary presented, or some similar experiences that really?
Yeah, very much so. So one of our principal challenges at the moment is, of the 5 databases we prioritize, 2 of them gather almost identical data. And what we found out was that they feed into 2 different international reporting processes, and that's why they were set up. So there's a lot of back and forth that is frankly not a conversation about technology or data, but is about people and power and structures, which is that at a high level, should these databases be combined into one, or can they remain separate? And obviously there are real incentives and tensions around that. So really, just a word as someone who came from sort of the international human rights system as a lawyer, we love reporting, we love being able to aggregate at global or regional level, but really being intentional and careful, I think, in just the way that Gary was saying about how we're duplicating systems to address only one use case when there are many. And that you may address one use case and then create other problems by not thinking about how different kinds of data or research initiatives combine together.
Thanks, Beverley. Any response to that, Gary?
Yeah, no, just agree. Yeah, it's the more you dig into this, the more you realise we've got this with several organisations where you can quite quickly see there's overlap with databases and data coming out, but to make a suggestion of, well, we don't need all this is actually not. You learn the hard way that it's not a great idea, because you're probably there's a reason why they're collected in 2 different departments, 2 different areas, because there's a slight difference in reporting, and I think there's issues there around making sure you're fully aware of the local context before actually trying to cut out one of those data sets.
Thanks. One of the things that came out in the LD4D study, using this behavioral science lens, what I personally found very interesting is that sometimes it's a data challenge, right? Oh, there's interoperability issues, or there's not enough data, or it's the wrong data. But very much so, it's often a challenge around the way that the data is used. That there's other factors that are affecting data use and decision making that have nothing to do with the data itself. And just learning about those factors and building them in. And as Gary said, it's not, I think the days of just being able to dump a lot of data onto a platform and say, okay, I've done my job as a researcher, are kind of, I mean, that's sort of the old way of doing it. And if we want to really support transformation and support use, it's really about socialized, all the social and behavioral things that Marilyn presented earlier around why data is or is not used, and what are the other things that are influencing or informing certain kinds of decisions. I think for LD4D as a network, we're trying to hone in and say, well, of the different challenges, which are the ones that are data challenges, which are the ones that actually are challenges that we can respond to with better data, and trying to sort of hone in on those. We haven't got the answer. But I think it's just a new lens for understanding some of the challenges, which makes it infinitely more complicated, but I think a lot more close to what the reality is when we're looking at some of these issues on the ground. So I'm wondering, either from Gary or from Beverley, have you encountered that? Are there data challenges that you've come across that are not actually about the data itself, but about, the use of the data, or the culture around the data, or the personalities or the power structures?
Yeah, Gary, if you don't mind, I can jump in here, because I also want to weave in a question that just got asked in the chat by Gareth about if there are any issues with databases being not open to access. I think that's a really good question and ties in to a little bit of what you're looking for. I took a pretty strong stance around government leadership 5 seconds ago in this chat, and there's a reason for that, because what we're finding is, in principle, the databases are not closed, but we have, and this is not only specific to Ethiopia, we've worked in 30, 40 countries, there's a hesitance to share in the absence of official policy, and especially in a place like Ethiopia, where things are quite hierarchical and quite top down, the absence of a data sharing policy at national level, at federal level in Ethiopia is a problem. And part of why our governing committee is structured that involves, luckily enough for us, to have the Minister of Agriculture involved, the State Minister of Livestock, is understanding that some data-based governance decisions are political ones and not data-based. So that's a key one. It's a series of having conversations highlighting for the key decision makers why this needs to be prioritized, and then giving them the space to have the additional conversations they need to have with other ministries and other agencies to say, okay, we need to get together and put a policy in place. Now, of course, I'm a lawyer. I love a good policy. I love a good law. That does not fix everything. I think Kenya has an exemplary data sharing, data governance space. It has not fixed all of the issues, but it's a start. And it's definitely something that we've seen in the context of the Alive program.
That's great. Thank you. There's a lot of really exciting action on the chat. Some people are sharing examples. There's quite a few questions. So I'd actually like to invite, I think we've had Mary from AU IBAR has posted a few different questions. So Mary, I'm going to try to unmute you, and maybe you can just raise a few of the points that you've mentioned, because it would be great to hear from your perspective. Just give me a moment while I figure out how to unmute you. Okay, Mary, you should be able to turn on your mic and camera now, if you're willing. We put you on the spot. Not quite working. All right, So maybe I can read the question that was posted. She's been asking a follow-up question to Beverley, and understanding, was there an assessment on the existence of a digital enabling environment in Ethiopia? And this is in reference to the future sustainability of the digital data platform. So this refers to policies, regulations on data privacy, data sharing, ICT, and perhaps this could be something that could be taken up by other African countries.
Definitely, we did. And we've had multiple to build from, some that we've done at Development Gateway in other areas, and then a major one that was done as a part of the previous roadmap process. So for us at DG, we don't build technical tools without doing an assessment first, because we understand, again, that all of this has to be contextualized. If we don't understand the system into which the technology is going, that's often what leads to failure. Like tons of sexy dashboards, lots of them not being used, in part because these things have to be looked at in context.
That's a great answer. Mary actually posted a follow-up question to Gary in the chat around issues on the cultural aspects of livestock and destocking in these pastoral communities, and whether you've considered those and how to deal with those.
Yeah, so this is the sort of the local cultural issues where it was actually good to have the elders in the parallel meeting going ahead, so they could actually discuss some of these issues. There was certainly a reluctance to sell, and a hope that the droughts would end, which meant that even though a lot of information was being provided that said that these droughts are going to happen, they are coming, or they're already here, that there was a reluctance to sell just on a basis of, well, the price has already dropped now, so let's hope it gets better soon so we can keep the livestock. We don't have an answer to that at the moment. That's something that was, it fed into some of our ideas. So it wasn't just a group of researchers thinking, oh yeah, logically the price would go down, everybody wants to sell, let's try and help that. We also had the same issues and discussions as well around, you can't just produce market information and prices, because then everybody goes to try and sell at the same time, potentially causing even further problems. So, but it was good to have those workshops with the various different people in the room, because it meant that you weren't just coming up with a data-driven approach to this, thinking, yeah, if we just provide all this stuff, everything's solved. So yes, the cultural issues would be an issue around, also around suggesting a switch in species in the future, and you're looking at 20, 30, 40 years time under climate scenarios, going in and just saying to a local area, you want to just grow, you want to now just have camels. That is obviously culturally, but I think that's where Marilyn and Busara and others come in, where there's a behavioural aspect of that process that you need to think about, in terms of, well, this is what the data would suggest is a sensible approach to improve resilience, but then we need to work with people to see how do you convert that into something that's palatable and culturally sensitive, and discuss that. So that's where I think behavioural science comes into play as well there.
Thanks, Gary. I was actually about to ask Marilyn if she would like to comment on anything that you've heard. If you have questions for the panel, you're thinking with your behavioral science sort of hat on. What are you hearing in terms of the approaches that are being taken, in terms of the way that some of these challenges are being tackled in the two projects? We'd love your thoughts.
Thank you, Vanessa. I think so. I'm hearing a lot of very interesting things, and I think as Busara, we do love working with different organizations, because we're not, let's say, livestock experts, but we love working with those who are, because we do learn a lot in how to come to a middle ground to solve issues. Because at the end of the day, it's about people. I think hearing a lot about the scattered data, and then you come to ask yourself, and I like what Development Gateway is doing, like what you mentioned, Beverley, starting with the government, right? And what you've also mentioned about the elders at the community is there's a place for authority. Sometimes you can present communities with data and tell them, oh, you need to vaccinate your livestock, because if you don't, they'll die. But if the community elders tell them, God did tell us that, or if they mention that, oh no, we didn't allow you to do that, or you present them with all the information, but there's still a barrier that comes that doesn't allow them to act on the information they've been given, then there's a problem. Again, with the influencers and the doers, there's a place that influencers can come in to allow the doers to actually, again, act. And just like we mentioned, you can have as many policies as possible to allow data sharing. You can have you can have good structure put up to allow action to take place. But if the government has no buy-in, if the politician in that ear, in the seat that has the power to do so, has no buy-in, and he has his own agenda, then everything more or less becomes useless, for lack of a better word, because the person who has the ability to put things into place just doesn't think it's important for him at that moment. So again, that is a challenge. How do you try to convince one person who has the power to change a lot to do stuff? Is usually now where we try and continue trying to understand the context within which this individual works in. And even just like the work we did with LD4D, and just like Bernard mentioned, there is a gap when it comes to data generators and then policymakers. The data that policymakers are in need of is not necessarily what's presented to them on the plate. The data that data generators come up with and present is not necessarily what the influencer is interested in. So finding that middle ground, again, is not easy. And just like the work that Beverley and her team is doing, considering that there are all these many facets that come into place, you will not get all the answers that you need. It'll continue being as complex as it gets the more you dig deeper into it. But sometimes trying to find your priority, because we do have limited resources, right? And even just as you mentioned, there are people coming up with the same type of data, but because they're all reporting to different processes or international reporting processes, then the data remains scattered. So again, it comes to buy-in, and I love that Gary and Beverley have mentioned like co-design workshops, and this includes involving the people from the beginning to the end, and not just creating the data or creating this work and then telling them, oh, here, eat it. It might not be the type of spice they like. It might not be salted to their type of liking. So this is just to commend the work that Gary and Beverley are doing. Like, it's amazing that you're considering all these things as complex as it gets in your work, because at the end of the day, it's human beings. The influencer is the person you're trying to have the buy-in so that the doers can do what they need to get done. And I do think prioritization is also the hardest thing to do. And again, with Beverley's work, they are doing a lot. So seeing that they're still able to get through this, having it long-term and sustainable and not just a one-off type of thing is very incredible and commendable. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much, Marilyn. No, it's really interesting to hear your perspective, and it sounds, that all of these projects are taking a type of behavioral science approach, maybe without explicitly saying it, you are actually working to understand the needs and to do things quite differently than maybe has been done in the past. There are so many excellent questions in the chat. I'm aware that we have 5 minutes left. We might have time for one more, but we will capture all the questions and make sure that the presenters get a chance to maybe respond by email. We'll circulate those after. So don't worry too much. We don't want to ignore everyone. I'm just going to, maybe as a final question, Anna posted in the chat whether the panelists could comment on the trade-offs between the robustness of data and user needs. And she's talking about the hierarchy of data sources. So data from peer-reviewed research is considered better, but it takes very long to generate. So should we look beyond research for data? And what are the role of different kinds of knowledge brokers in making data usable?
Okay, I'll try to be succinct. This is such a meaty question and an important one, because you don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. especially when you're talking about policymakers who have limited time, and if you can't give them what they need in that time frame, they will move on. So this is a part of why we built in an approach to resource mobilization more broadly. We find a lot when we're doing our work that we identify gaps that we can't fill, or we don't have the time to fill, or if we had another unlimited amount of money and more time, we could. So we try to triage. So it's really about a level of prioritization on where we do have strong data on specific indicators and focusing on visualizing and strengthening those and identifying where we see gaps, or where we see, okay, with a little bit better data collection, with a little bit better engagement, this data set or this indicator could get better, and identifying that for other partners who are in different stages of supporting the ecosystem. So for us, that's one of the ways that we also stay really focused when we're talking about the dashboard. We're not trying to address all data sets and all indicators at the same time. We know that some indicators are stronger than others, and really trying to focus in on where the low-hanging fruit is, because it's also a process of building trust over time with decision makers. And if you start with some that are of quality, as you know well, that if the data isn't of quality, it affects the level of trust. Then if a policymaker goes to a platform and the data is suspect, they're not going to come back to that platform again. So we're really very careful to focus in on where we know we can strengthen those first and say, look, we know that you really want to talk about destocking, but we know there's a quality issue there. But here are the other indicators that you also care about that have stronger data that we can visualize for you. Know that we are starting here, and we hope that that will build your sense of trust in this as a source to continue investing with your partners in these other areas.
Thanks so much, Beverley. We have about 2 minutes left. I'm afraid if you have any last questions, please put them in the chat. We will capture these. I'm actually going to pop up a poll, which is, do you want to continue this conversation? So we have an opportunity through the LD4D network to actually have some kind of a light touch community of practice, or just a follow-up discussion, or just a little email group on this. So if you're interested, I'd be very happy to follow up on this, because I do see a lot of interest and a lot of questions. And we do see this as the starting point for a lot of the work that we think the community is doing anyway. So if the poll is up, can you see it? Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
so
we can
feel
see
free
it.
to vote. If you don't want to vote, you don't have to. I'll leave it up for another moment or two, while I thank our presenters very, very much for taking the time to share your work. I think, in a way, you've been quite vulnerable, because we've asked you to share things that are working, maybe things that are not working, work in progress. But I think everyone really appreciates hearing about the challenges and how you're overcoming them. I think we're really pleased to support this kind of discussion, and really we believe that this is the way forward. So we do encourage everyone to have a look at the Decision Makers tool. Ask Fiona to put the link in the chat one last time, and give us feedback, use it. If you're interested in a use case, get in touch. And thank you all again. So after this, we'll put the recording and the materials together, and we'll make that available on our website, and we'll let everyone know, so you can review things and share it with anyone who could not attend. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
We hope to be in touch soon. Okay. Bye.